Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today taking a break from the battle replay videos, instead choosing to rank all Shock Cavalry in Total War the Dawnless Days. Before we get started, let's break down what the Dawnless Days is, that being a mod for the game Total War Attila, mod linked in the description of course, completely overhauling the game and basing it off of the world of Lord of the Rings. In previous videos I looked at and compared the bow infantry units in the mod as well as spear infantry, ranking them in terms of how useful they are, using their statistics, availability, and abilities to determine their rankings. In this video we'll be doing the same thing but instead with Shock Cavalry, horsemen who excel at delivering thundering charges into the ranks of the enemy with lances, breaking their formations and eviscerating units, although they aren't as durable in sustained combat as other units. At the end of the video, the charts that I use to compare their qualities will be shown. Before I get into the rankings, first I'd like you to like and subscribe if you like what you're hearing, and after that I want to make it clear that these rankings are purely my opinion and as such are subjective, so if my rankings don't match yours, don't feel bad. That said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the units in the comments. All up, the mod, as of version 0.6.0, currently has 14 Shock Cavalry units spread across its various factions, although the number of Shock Cavalry units may be subject to change in the future, as are these rankings. In addition to this, several units in this video are shared between factions, however they've been differentiated due to the different impact they have on the rosters they find themselves in. With all that said, let's start the rankings. Coming dead last we have a surprising entry, the Aerid of the Eastfold, who as their name suggests, are part of the Rohan roster, an odd position for a unit fielded by the premier cavalry faction in the mod. The real reason why these silver tier 2 medium shock cavalry come in last place is because they are quite simply unnecessary and have restrictions on their recruitment. While a max limit of 3 units per army isn't necessarily the be or end all when it comes to unit usefulness, as I'm so often reminded in the comments of these videos, comments I actually really appreciate. In this case, the restrictions do hurt this unit's usefulness, as Rohan has access to another tier 2 shock cavalry unit that has no recruitment restrictions and is flat out better stats wise, meaning that this unit has nothing to add to a prospective Rohirrim army. Overall, a unit that fails due to its lack of purpose more so than anything else. Just missing out on last place we have the Serpent Guards of the Haradrim, a gold tier 4 medium shock cavalry unit. These guys can serve as a potential Haradrim general, boosting their usefulness, although it should be noted this decreases the amount you can afford to commit to battle without risking your general, as this unit due to its elite status is also limited to a max strength of 3. However, as a shock cavalry unit, it really doesn't have too much to write home about, generally being underpowered somewhat compared to other gold tier cavalry, being more of a match for tier 3 cavalry which can generally be fielded in far larger numbers, but this unit is generally going to be at a disadvantage if your enemy has a robust force of professional cavalry available. Speaking of professional cavalry, because the Haradrim lack heavy shock cavalry in the later tiers apart from this unit, these guys will be forced to take up that role for your army, a role it's not suited for, being better as a spear tip of your army. Overall, as a unit, the Serpent Guard rank lowly due to being underpowered and forced into inopportune roles. Coming in ahead of the Serpent Lancers we have their predecessors in the Haradrim faction, the Haradrim Lancers. Silver tier 2 light shock cavalry. This unit owes its low place to a reversal of factors compared to the previous unit. Whereas the Serpent Guards become available too late and in limited numbers to make much of an impact, these guys, due to the faction lacking any tier 3 shock cavalry, are forced to fight not only equivalent tier 2 foes who they come up lacking against, but also forced into uphill battles against professional tier 3 foes as a way to stop the bleeding, being brutalized in such matchups. The only saving grace the unit has is that it's able to be recruited without restriction, meaning that you can somewhat offset combat inferiority with numerical superiority. Overall, a poor unit due to both the circumstances it finds itself in and its lackluster stats. Missing out on the top 10 by a hair we have the Variag Lancers of the Easterlings, a silver tier 3 heavy shock cavalry unit. This unit actually performs quite adequately and is generally good. It is however also the only shock cavalry unit the faction has access to, and is restricted to a max of 3 per army, meaning that the Eastlings will almost always be fighting from a weaker position in terms of horsemen. However, because the Eastlings aren't a faction that necessarily focus on cavalry as the premier part of their armies, though that Rohan and to a lesser extent the Haradrim do, this unit's restrictions don't hamper it as much, meaning that it more or less suits its role as a heavy support unit, albeit one that if facing off against foes with dedicated mounted options is at a disadvantage. Overall, a unit that has its uses, but is severely outclassed by the competition. Just making it into the top 10 are the Knights of the House of Eol, A gold tier 4 heavy shock cavalry unit, these guys are the premier horsemen of Rohan, being the heaviest hitters the faction has access to, serving as generals as well as being the unit that King Theoden and Prince Theodred command. Much like the previous unit, this unit has recruitment restrictions. Unlike the previous unit though, these don't have anywhere near as much of an impact as these guys don't have to fulfill the role of mounted support for an entire army alone. Rohan's plentiful horsemen meaning these guys are only needed for their particular role, that being the heaviest of hammers to crack the hardest of nuts. However, because Rohan has such good horsemen already available, this unit becomes more or less superfluous in most situations, only really being needed rarely when a boost in strength is required. Overall, what this means is that this is a unit which sits somewhat ahead of the competition due to having a clearly delineated role. It also falls behind due to not often being needed the way that the upcoming units are. Coming in ahead of the Knights of the House of Eorl, the champion Reavers of the Dunlending stand tall. Another gold tier 4 unit, these very heavy shock cavalry rank above their horse-lord enemies despite their recruitment restriction for one simple reason. They provide their faction with variety when it comes to the battlefield, not even counting their potential general status. The Dunlendings as a faction are one which focuses on infantry almost entirely, so to have one of the heaviest cavalry units available up your sleeves is a nasty surprise, meaning you can pivot between assaulting enemies with hordes of offensive infantry or armoured fists of cavalry supported by screaming infantry. Overall, a useful and unique unit which enriches the playstyle of the faction it finds itself in. Next up we have the epitome of chivalry in the Dawnless Days, the Knights of the Silver Swan. Continuing the trend of gold tier 4 units which are by design limited to 3 per army and capable of serving as general for their respective factions, this very heavy shock cavalry unit is an absolute bulldozer on the battlefield, significantly boosting the power of Gondor while working in tandem with the other cavalry of that faction, meaning that unlike the Serpent Guards, these guys can focus on their role of being battle winners capable of turning the tide of a conflict with a single charge, rather than being forced to parry enemy cavalry the way previous units in this video are. Ultimately, this unit is a proactive unit, which is something all shock cavalry should aspire to be when it comes to the battlefield role. Unlike the Knights of the House of Eorl, these guys tend to see somewhat more service due to their respective faction not having as wide a range of cavalry available. Overall, a useful unit and arguably one of the best looking too. Next up, we have a fairly unique unit, the Scouts of Rohan, whose name very clearly highlights which faction the unit can be found in. The unit being unique due to the fact it's the only bronze tier 1 shock cavalry in the mod. What this means for the light shock cavalry is that it boosts the offensive power of Rohan massively in the early game, essentially being allowed to run roughshod over enemies before they have access to their own shock cavalry to counter these guys. That said, you should take care not to become reliant on them for more elite army builds, as they do become rapidly outclassed. Luckily, Rohan has better cavalry well placed to replace them. Overall, a very useful unit that helps cement Rohan's identity as a cavalry faction. Coming up next and just missing out on the top 5, we have the Dale Cavalry Regiment, who as the name suggests can be found in the Dale roster. These silver tier 3 very heavy shock cavalry are the supreme cavalry unit fielded by their faction, being their equivalent professional horsemen, capable of fighting more or less toe-to-toe with enemy forces and acting as a hammer to bring about quick victories for a faction that would otherwise be relatively grindy in battle. Combined with the explosive power they give Dale, the fact that they have no recruitment limitations mean that they can be used en masse, elevating them against previous units that can't be used in such a fashion. Overall, a very useful unit and one that's more or less as powerful as the upcoming units, but is somewhat diminished by the fact that Dale isn't an intended cavalry civilization. Making it into the top 5, we have the iconic Riders of Rohan, a silver tier 2 heavy shock cavalry unit that will almost always make up the core of Rohan's armies and mid-game armies, being the successor to the Scouts of Rohan, which enables Rohan to be competitive at that point in the game. As a unit, these guys completely make the Aerid of the Eastfold useless, outperforming them in terms of stats and availability, their existence essentially saving Rohan from being forced to rely on subpar cavalry in the mid-game, quite a controversial position to have been in for the mod's premier heavy cavalry faction. A great unit, however not quite as crucial as the others coming up due to there being an abundance of other cavalry to fall back onto. Just beating out the Riders of Rohan, we have the iconic Gondor Cavalry, these silver tier 3 very heavy shock cavalry just missing out on the top 3 positions. The professional cavalry of the faction, these guys are also the only cavalry the faction has access to apart from the Knights of the Silver Swan. While their late position in the Gondor roster means that until these guys become available, Gondor is a relatively slow and grindy faction without rapid counters to enemy cavalry, once you gain access to them the faction's playstyle changes completely, mobility and power becoming the name of the game. Due to these guys' existence, the Knights of the Silver Swan become both more and less useful, as they make them less imperative to victory. However, that also means that the Silver Swan unit gets the flexibility to serve in its role as the spearhead of your army. Overall, a highly critical unit for success when playing as Gondor in mid to late game armies. Snatching the bronze medal today, we find ourselves looking at the Noldorin horsemen fielded by Imladris. Silver tier 3 heavy shock cavalry. These guys score so highly due to the state of the faction they find themselves in, Imladris having a very bare bones roster, meaning that every unit fielded counts that much more compared to fleshed out factions. As a unit, they give Imladris heavy hitting power, which is sorely needed and works well in combination with their armies being designed around being elite. However, the reason why they don't score slightly higher is that their faction has more of a cavalry presence, which means this unit isn't as necessarily critical to success as the next unit coming up is. That next unit coming up are the Noldorin Equestrians, who for all intents and purposes are the exact same unit as the Noldorin Horsemen, except that they're found in the Linden faction, something which has determined their placing immensely. Because Linden entirely lacks cavalry apart from these guys, they are for all intents and purposes a linchpin of the faction, which in its current state is just as bereft of units as Imladris. What this means is that this unit of Silver tier 3 heavy shock cavalry are as crucial as you can be in this mod in making Linden even potentially viable. A pretty damn good unit to begin with, but one which due to its circumstances is boosted leagues ahead. Coming in to take the gold, and also continuing the trend of the units coming in both first and last place sharing the same faction, we have the Knights of the Mark, Silver tier 3 heavy shock cavalry. These guys are the name of the game when playing as Rohan, being the key strength of your armies on the open battlefield. While some of the previous units may have the edge when it comes to certain stats, this unit more so than any other is the linchpin on which its respective faction's game plan revolves, capable of going toe-to-toe with almost any foe, while also having the ability to swarm tougher enemies as required. Overall, a fantastic unit, and one which encapsulates just how crucial shock cavalry can be to a successful game plan. So there we have it, all the shock cavalry in the current version of the mod ranked. Remember, these rankings are purely subjective. If you disagree, please let me know in the comments. I'd absolutely love to know what you think, as it would give me insight that I'd otherwise be lacking. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. More ranking videos will be coming up, as well as army build videos, as well as battle scenarios too. So if you like the sounds of that, stick around the channel. Before I head out, I'll give you a reminder that the tables that I used to compare the units are just coming up. But with all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.